Exciting stuff, the render settings. One thing to know about Arnold is that the render settings are really incredibly easy to compared to some other render engines I've used. So this will go pretty smoothly. I will skip the comment tab because this is the same for nearly all render engines, and let's just dive in straight to the Arnold Render Sampling tab, the most important part of your Arnold render settings, because these settings directly control the amount of noise in your image. So the first thing we really see are these. It's kind of like a debugging area for the total amount of samples, because there's a few things we have to know about these settings. First of all, as we go up and down on these sliders, you'll see that the total amount of samples is actually the square number of the input value over here. So this is important. The amount of samples between, or the difference between the amount of samples between 9 anti-aliasing samples and 10 is a lot bigger than, for example, 2 and 3. So this is an exponential increase in samples. It's important to know. Then, the AA samples also act as a multiplier on the other samples. So for example, if you have 3 diffuse samples and 3 AA samples, then you'll have 81 total diffuse samples. As we increase the camera samples, you'll see that the diffuse samples still rise. So it gets multiplied. This is very important. Okay, so then what do we need to know? The camera samples are essentially the control over your motion blur noise or your depth of field noise, or just your anti-aliasing. A minimum of 3 will always be required to produce a final image. So then the diffuse samples. This controls your global illumination noise. Your specular levels, or your specular sampling, controls your specular roughness noise, etc., etc. Same for refraction or transmission, subsurface scattering, and indirect volumes, which essentially is the global illumination inside of volumes in Arnold. Next up, we see the lock sampling pattern. Arnold provides the option to lock the noise pattern from frame to frame. I have never used this, and I can't think of any reason to use this either. So let's just leave this off. Then use auto bump in subsurface scattering. Auto bump is a really neat feature of Arnold that we will get into later. Essentially, it will convert part of your displacement map to a bump map if there is not enough resolution in your geometry or in your subdivided geometry. So when you're working with subsurface scattering and you use or you rely on auto bump, I would definitely enable this. It takes a bit longer to compute, but the results are much more realistic. And then the clamping, these are options to clamp your samples when you render the image. So what this does is it limits your range of your values. I personally never use this unless there are some specific scenarios where you deal with fireflies. Generally, you don't want to use this if you don't need to, because you will lose range in compositing. Your value range will be clipped. Then there's the filter. This is pretty advanced stuff, but essentially what this does is the way certain subsample values are averaged into pixel values. So a Gaussian with a width of 2 is perfectly fine for nearly everything. Sometimes for print stuff I prefer to set it to 1.8 because it tends to be a tiny bit sharper. Then let's move on to the ray depth settings. The ray depth settings is just a fancy name for the amount of bounces in your scene. The bounces of the separate light scattering events, such as the diffuse bounces, the specular bounces, and the transmission bounces. This has a large effect on your image. So let's let this render. And for example, right now there is one diffuse bounce, which means there is one bounce of global illumination. If we put this to 0, there is only direct light in the diffuse component right now. This is generally something we don't want to do. The settings I usually use, I start with 5, 5, 5, 5, maybe 8 for transmission, because in transmission media there's usually more scattering interfaces. So over here there's a nice amount of bounces, and then I step it down to see is there still a significant effect. For example, with conductive materials such as metals, you will need more specular bounces than with, for example, dielectrics, just because there is more to bounce, there's more light to bounce in the specular component. Then let's move on to the environment tab. There's a whole lesson later on the atmosphere. Essentially what this does is it creates a scene-wide volume or participating medium, and this can be used to, create fog effects or all that kind of participating medium effects. It's pretty cool stuff. A whole lesson is dedicated to this. And the motion blur settings, if you want to enable motion blur, you can just click here, and most of the time that's all you will need to do. You can add in some extra keys, which is kind of like the subdivision settings on your motion blur calculations. If you want a smoother effect instead of more like a jagged, these are my subsample steps, then you can increase this, but watch out, you need to hold the same scene in memory a few times more. So I've personally never had to do this, but there are specific cases where this is necessary. The length, this determines the length of your motion blur, but from my experience, this has always been fine. The lights, let's not go into this. This is pretty advanced stuff. Then the textures. I will talk about textures and linear workflow and color management in one of the next lessons. So for now, let's just leave it as it is, because the settings are set up the way they should be. Then the subdivision settings, I personally never touch this because we set these subdivision levels specifically on the shape nodes, so there's no need to set these over here. Then the system tab. These settings over here you don't generally touch very often. They're pretty advanced settings or settings I don't use very often. A couple of things. I always disable swatch rendering. So the swatch renders are these tiny previews on your nodes. I personally find them useless, so I disable them. It makes Maya a lot smoother. The same goes for example, like image previews, etc. If I select an image, I know what it is, so I don't use this. Then there's the bucket scanning order. Do you want to go from top down or in a spiral? Depending on your image, you probably want to change this to see where your region of interest is. I like from the top because it gives me a nice linear progression. Then auto detect threads. This is very useful to save a couple of threads for your so Arnold doesn't try and eat up every last bit of resource on your computer. It just makes Maya, it gives Maya a bit of room to breathe, and I usually set this to -2 or 3, depending on the machine I'm on. This gives, it just makes for a smoother, more enjoyable experience or shading experience. And we don't use these. It's all pretty advanced stuff that we don't need to discuss right now. By the way, all of these, you can find all the information in the documentation. The documentation is awesome, so if you have any questions, just go and look over there. It's really awesome. Then we find the AOV tab. So the AOVs, it stands for Arbitrary Output Variables. So it's a fancy word for your render passes. So different scattering events in the shading can be split up into different buffers, and you can then save these out to different images or combine them into a multi-channel EXR, for example. So let's have a look at this. Right now, in your AOV list in the Arnold render view over here, there's just a beauty. So let's try and add a couple more. So in the built-in, let's try and add the normals, the world position, the Z-depth, the diffuse, direct illumination, indirect illumination, specular. That should do for now. So there's plenty available. Let's see what I do. Over here now, we have the different AOVs available. So normal, world position, diffuse component, the direct illumination, etc., etc. It's really handy to have these here in your render view to debug certain shading problems. And one thing we should note about this is that in Arnold, by default, if you save out an image, all of these different AOVs will be split up in different images. And generally, this is what you would want in a production facility. It just makes certain things easier. But for example, for freelancers, it's often a bit annoying that it spits it out in all these different images. So if you don't want this, you can go to select driver in your attribute editor, and over here just merge the AOVs. And this will merge everything into one nice multi-channel EXR. Then we have the AOV shaders. I will come back to this in a later lesson on Cryptomatte. So this is a very new feature, and all about this in a next lesson. So then we find the diagnostics tab. This is essentially all about, for example, logging. Logging is very important, so I like to set the verbosity level to warnings and info. This is the amount of information the renderer spits out. And this is very important because at some point you will encounter that Arnold does not want to render your image. And Arnold will complain about this. And where will it complain? It will complain if you're on Windows, either in the output window, or if you're on Mac or on Linux, it will complain in the terminal. So this is very important. If Arnold does not render, it will always give a reason. So first thing to look for is the log. Then we won't go into these. But then there's a feature overrides. For example, if you don't want any displacement or subdivision in your scene, you can disable it scene-wide over here. I don't necessarily use the other ones so much, but I do use the subdivision and displacement one because often you spend quite a lot of time pre-computing the displacements and the subdivision before you start rendering, and it's good to be able to turn this off scene-wide. So that concludes it for the render settings. It was pretty straightforward, just the way Arnold was designed to be.